All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we're talking about qualitative interviewing skills. Now, right before this podcast, I'm sure you looked at the question how to ask qualitative questions. And asking qualitative questions is really the starting point. Okay? And you got to get off to a good start, so you got to ask good questions. But I really want you to focus here because great qualitative interviewers ask a good question, but then the 80% rule is you got to be good at doing the interviewing. And we're going to talk today in this podcast about what makes a good interviewer. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So, wrong way. We start off with a warning. And the reason is that most of you do probing questions the wrong way. Culturally, the way we've been raised, we asked very biased probing questions. We don't know how to. We don't generally ask in our culture about unbiased questions. So you're naturally going to, in a way, talk the wrong way for qualitative research. So this is one of those things that it's hard to overcome. It takes practice, and needs to be aware of it. But I want you to know that if you struggle with it, it's because you're kind of trained culturally to talk the wrong way. It's simple. I'm going to explain the concept with you, and it's simple to understand. It's just not easy to do. Simple to understand, but not easy. All right. Are you going into sales? Many of our students go into sales. I spent 6 years of my life in sales. I loved sales. Sales was a great place for me to start. I learned so much about myself. But one of the things that I think is so important for salespeople is asking probing questions, doing a good job of interviewing. Now, I was in 6 years of sales, and then later on in life as a consultant, I kind of went back into the field, into sales. And by the way, I was 10 times better when I went back. Why? Because I went back as a qualitative researcher. And when I went back as a qualitative researcher, and I used lots of probing questions where the focus was on understanding first, and then suggesting what they should buy and closing, right? If you approach sales from that perspective, I think you're going to be 10 times more successful. Knowing what I know now, if you're a good interviewer in sales, good at understanding the customer and their environment first, and then you tell them what to buy, and then you go for the close, right? Then you're going to be successful. Anyhow, it's all about probing questions, all right? And that's what it says, all about probing questions. So let's talk about qualitative interviewing skills. It's about probing questions, right? And if you think about this apple, you ask the question, tell me about life as a CMU student, right? And then they go on and on and on, and they talk about it, and then we say, probing question, can you tell me more about that experience? And we get closer to the apple core, and then they say something. You say, hey, another probing question, can you give me an example of when that last happened? Now we're getting close to the core. What does it mean to you to have that? Boom, there we go, right? So these probing questions are going to get you to the core of the apple, and that's really what our job is. All right, we start with the basic question, and we keep asking probing questions until we get to the core of the idea. All right, so we ask the question, and then we listen. And by the way, in sales and qualitative research, pay attention, because so many of you are at that age where you're thinking about what you should say. I suggest just listen. Guess what? Don't talk. If you find yourself doing a lot of the talking, you're not doing a good job of interviewing. It's time to listen. I love that graphic. All right, so probing questions. Let's talk about bias probing questions, right? When we think, so this, I'm kind of showing my age here, but that's all right because I'm old. But Katie Couric was the big news star before your time, right? And she was the queen of biased probing questions, right? And so she would ask, so somebody should be new. And I know why she does it, because she needs to get a good story. She needs them to say these things on TV, right? And she's only got 2 minutes to get them to say these things. So to give you an example, a guy loses his house in the flood, and she goes in there with her bias probing questions. You must feel awful. You must be depressed. You must be, she would just go on about leading the witness is really the way to think about that. And so let's not do it. Let me give you an example of an unbiased probe. So someone says to you, boy, that really upset me, right? And then you should say, unbiased, can you tell me more about that? Or, what do you mean by that? Or, can you give me an example of that? These are great. They're not leading the witness. They're getting them to give you more D squared. They're getting them to elaborate, to give more details, to get more of that discovery in an unbiased way. They're so important. I'm going to go again. Can you tell me more about that? What do you mean by that? Can you give me an example of that? And so whenever you're in an interview and you don't know what to say, right? You're like, oh my goodness, they stopped talking. I don't know. Say, can you tell me more about that? And then be quiet and listen, right? Or can you give me an example of that? And then be quiet. Get them to open up. Get them trained from the get-go that they're going to do a lot of the talking. It's simple, not easy. So it's simple to understand. It's just not easy to do. And practice makes perfect. Like everything else in life, practice makes perfect. All right, my friends, I'll see you in the next exciting episode of Marketing 450.